I want to introduce Dr. Ray, his bio. There are people who are on Zoom who have not had the chance to read his bio, and then we'll have him come on. Dr. Rashawn Ray is a professor in the Department of Sociology and an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Women's Studies at the University of Maryland. Dr. Ray is also an American Institute for Research Vice President and the Executive Director of the Air Equity Initiative, which is a $100 million investment in behavioral and social science research and technical assistance to address segregation by race and place. Between 2019 and 2021, Dr. Ray served as a David Rubenstein Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. His research addresses the mechanisms that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequity. Dr. Ray has published over 50 books and over 50 op-eds. He's written for numerous newspapers and has appeared on numerous television news shows. One example of one of his books is called How Families Matter: Simply Complicated Intersections of Race, Gender, and Work, which he co-authored with Dr. Pamela Jackson. And Bad Apples Come from Rotten Trees and Policing. And op-ed on the CARES Act risks becoming the CAST Act. Here's how we change that. He regularly testifies at the federal and state levels on racial equity, policing and criminal justice reform, health policy, wealth disparities, and family policy. Dr. Ray has been awarded the American Association for the Advancement of Science Mani L. Baumek Award for Public Engagement with Science, the Public Understanding of Sociology Award from the American Sociological Association, the Morris Rosenberg Award for Outstanding Sociological Achievement from the DC Sociological Society, and the Outstanding Young Alumni Award from Indiana University. And he was just recently awarded an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. So this is the work that he has done, and I've only read just a little bit, but I want to just share a little bit of knowing him. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Ray almost a year ago to the day, October 27th of last year at the White House, when Vice President Kamala Harris invited he, myself, and 8 other researchers and activists to propose novel ideas and interventions to support the future employment and health of young Black and brown men, including those without a college degree, with the charge of how we can help them find a place at the table of prosperity. Now, you have to understand that when the vice president asks questions, she wants answers immediately. This is the context. I'm trying to set it for you. And you will only have a minute to make your argument. She clarified her way to us in the beginning of the meeting. That is, she loves information, so do not hold back or hesitate. Each of us was nervous for when our time would come, and it would only last a minute. Now, while all of us would eventually give our feedback to the vice president, Dr. Ray was the quickest among us. I was struck by the rapid-fire way in which Dr. Rashawn Ray threw out data in less than a minute. Not only that, as quickly as he would drop the data, the vice president would ask a new question. Watching the two of them was like watching a U.S. Open Finals tennis match. They went back and forth, and needless to say, Dr. Ray got more than 1 minute. Now, I promise you, I do not feel any particular kind of way about that whatsoever. But it was a joy to watch. It was also then I had the great idea that I got to bring this brother to see Dr. Clayton. This is amazing. Dr. Ray and I struck up a friendship over families, about talking about the stress of being in the academy and what is it like to raise boys in this hostile society. And I have considered him a friend ever since. His amazing work and heart to bring interventions and policies to protect communities struggling with structural racism is absolutely remarkable. He's going to speak on overpolicing of Black boys and men, reimagining solutions to collateral consequences. Welcome, Dr. Rashawn Ray.
That introduction was so amazing, I can go home. That was great, thank you. And similarly, I had remarks prepared about the White House visit as well. And I'll tell you all from my vantage point. where I saw Dr. Stevenson command the room in a way that I haven't before, where people were like, wow, this dude knows what he's talking about in this room, and we need to listen to him. And so as he talked about how I opened, what I remember was him playing cleanup. When you play cleanup, you get to hear what everybody else has said, and you like, here are the gaps that exist. This is how we need to fill them, and this is how we need to move forward. And it was definitely marvelous to see. And I'll say this, I took the advantage. Normally, I'm like running out of places, right? Because we were talking about family, and I said, I just have to get some more of his time. And so I literally went back to grad school mode. So for those of you in grad school, I'm telling you, take every opportunity to meet people that you can. Even as an undergraduate, just take that opportunity. So I knew that he was running to the train station. I was like, can I give you a ride? Right? And it just so happened traffic hit. So then I got to spend more time with him. And I remember calling the next thing I had to do, which was probably getting to get to my kids. I was like, I'm gonna be like 15 minutes late. Cause I'm like, I literally have to get this knowledge and everything that he was sharing. And I mean, as you all know, Dr. Stevenson is a giant in the field of racial literacy and child development and psychology and just the social sciences and education more broadly. And I'm honored to be here to give this year's Constance E. Clayton Lecture with you all this evening. And I'll say this, she's present here. And let me tell you why. Not only because people here who love her and who respected her and who know her so well, but because she sent me questions before we got here. So for those of you that know her, you know that this is what she does. So I literally have a whole like section prepared for questions that she sent to Rhonda beforehand. And I'll make sure when we get to Q&A that we'll queue that up. And so I'm definitely excited about that. For everyone who put on this event, I'm honored to be here. Again, I shouted out Rhonda, and the rest of the team have simply been phenomenal. You know, as Dr. Stevenson knows, and other people like Dr. Spencer and others, we give a lot of these talks. But this one is different, not only because of what Dr. Stevenson mentioned about this being only the second African-American woman who has a named chair in the country. Like that, people don't really realize how significant that is. But also because Constance Clayton and Dr. Stevenson run such a tight ship, I was like, geez, this is one of the easiest times I've had preparing for something and getting here. So I definitely have to say that and shout that out. The final thing that I want to say is obviously giving my condolences to the Clayton family, people who loved her, her friends. I look forward to hearing those remarks and hearing what you all have to say. And it's unfortunate that I didn't get the opportunity to meet her, but the fact that I got to correspond via email, I could feel all of that you were talking about coming through. I was like, I got to be ready to really answer this woman's questions. I was like, those questions are serious, which we'll get to. I also want to say to you all, amazing. I need to purchase all the books. I need signed copies. As Dr. Stevenson was mentioned, I have an 11 and a 13-year-old, and I'll probably reference them as we're going through this, but you all were outstanding. Simply marvelous. Don't ever stop dreaming. Don't ever stop writing. Don't ever stop talking. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't shoot for the stars, because you can. One thing my grandmother always told me, she said, always strive for the stars, because when you fail, and fail you will at least land on top of the building that you were once in. And that is how you continue to build building blocks to success. So bravo to you all. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. All right, so let's get down to business. I'm going to probably formally talk to you all for about 45, 50 minutes, and then I look forward to the questions that you all have for me, and I look forward to an engaging Q&A. I appreciate you all coming out. So obviously we're talking about the overpolicing of Black boys and men, and really thinking about reimagining solutions to collateral consequences, and I'll get into what that is. I think for a lot of us, most recently with the advent of social media, images like this of Michael Brown in St. Louis have become all too commonplace. And as we know, that a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement that we've had over the past 11 years or so, if we want to call it that, really started with the killing of Trayvon Martin in Florida in 2012. And I've written about this extensively since then. And I came about this work through two different avenues. One was just doing research, which some of us were talking about earlier, which was my work on physical activity and obesity and just race and class differences when I was doing my postdoc in Berkeley. That was the research way. And I'll share all of the research that I have. But it was also personal, because when Trayvon Martin was killed, I was sitting in my home in Oakland, and I was watching my 1-year-old do what 1-year-olds do. You know, they do 1-year-old stuff. They try to move, but they not quite moving, but they trying to, right? So I'm watching him, and I'm holding my newborn, who was born less than a month before Trayvon Martin was killed. And I remember sitting there, I'm rocking my youngest, and I'm watching my oldest, and I was thinking, whatever you think you're doing in this world, you're not doing enough. Whatever you think it is, you're not doing enough to protect them and people who look like them. And the second time that happened was when Philando Castile was killed in Minnesota. And what I remember vividly about that, if you were able to get through that video, is that at the end of the video, there was a little girl, Diamond Reynolds' daughter. Diamond Reynolds, of course, was the partner of Philando, who was with him when he was killed. And Diamond Reynolds said, "Mommy, don't cry, I'm here." She was like 3 or 4 years old. "Mommy, don't cry, I'm here." I'll never forget those words. And I remember going to pick my boys up from school. They were in preschool at the time. Again, having this moment where looking at them and their friends saying, you are not doing enough to protect their innocence, and you need to do more. And that actually launched a lot of my public scholarship. I was already doing stuff. I was doing more than my colleagues, but I wasn't doing enough. And so I highlight that because those were those two parallel tracks, and it was deliberate for me. I didn't exactly know how that was going to fall out, but I knew that I needed to talk to policymakers. I knew that I needed to get in front of journalists. I knew that I needed to get in front of individuals that have a larger outlet than just the 25, 50 people, if we lucky, that read our journal articles and cite them, to be honest with you, right? And so for me, that was how it started. And part of thinking about this is as we think about this particular book chapter that I wrote, If Only He Didn't Wear a Hoodie, which really took a social psychological dive into what happened with Trayvon Martin. And just to refresh people's memory, right? That these were the sort of statements being made about what happened. Of course, that's Geraldo Rivera. For those of you that's like me, that's getting up there in age, you remember he had like a show at one point in time. I thought that he was like bigger than Oprah. I was like, everybody watches his show. But for those of you that are younger, look it up. He had a very, very popular show. Just look at what's bolded here. He made a quote that he said, "I think the hoodie is as much responsible for Trayvon Martin's death as much as George Zimmerman was." The hoodie, right? I should have actually wore my blazer that got the hoodie on it just for this reference. And then Bill O'Reilly, of course, you all know as a conservative pundit, he said he was wearing a hoodie and he looked a certain way. And that way is how gangsters look. He stressed the word like that, how gangsters look. I found it ironic because when I look at this image of Geraldo, I'm like, he got on a hoodie, right? And then we can look at other images. Mark Zuckerberg, for years, all he wore was a hoodie and a t-shirt. And then Bill Belichick just got his 300th win. He wears a hoodie all the time. Nobody's tripping off of them. What is it about them that makes them different from Trayvon? Because clearly it's not about the hoodie. What we know that it's about Trayvon's blackness. And it's about how blackness becomes something that is a threat to society. And even when black people are unarmed, their blackness becomes weaponized in a way that leads to deleterious outcomes that I'm going to talk about here. One of the interesting things about blackness and maleness in particular in that intersection is if you followed the trial of George Zimmerman, who ultimately was found not guilty of killing Trayvon Martin, even though Trayvon had as much right to defend himself, actually more than George Zimmerman did, because George Zimmerman was the one who initiated it in a stand your ground state. We have to think about how the deck is stacked against people with darker skin in this country and oftentimes around the world. George Zimmerman said something really, really interesting. During the arraignment, he looked at the Martin family and said, "I thought he was older." As if that justifies it. But part of what he was doing, he was aging up this black boy who, last time I checked, when he was killed, he was 17. And at that age, you can't vote. Supposedly, you can't do a whole bunch of other stuff that we know teenagers do. But the point is that he was not an adult. Now, interestingly, with Michael Brown, instantly turning 18 makes you an adult. And all of a sudden transposes a lot of things. Unless, of course, oftentimes you're black and you're male, or you're oftentimes in lower income communities. Well, we know that individuals are oftentimes tried as adults, even as children. So we can think about how all this is put together, but one of the things that people oftentimes don't put together is raise your hand if you knew that the Martin family received a $1 million payout from a homeowners association. I'll just say this. This is one of the things I love about doing research. When you're a researcher and you can have a data point that nobody's heard of. So just indulge me for a second. Because, you know, we went COVID for a while and we get back in crowds. But just raise your hand if you had heard of Trayvon Martin before I mentioned him today. Keep your hand raised if you knew that $1 million settlement had been paid out. Not a single person. We got to ask ourselves why we didn't know that. Now, if you're like me, regardless of how I felt about this boy, 17-year-old teenager, being killed, I would have felt some kind of way if I was in that HOA, if my money being spent to cover something for what this person did, what George Zimmerman did. This is how payouts work. That is going to be a theme as we go forth. Part of what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to cover 6 things with you all today. First, I'm going to talk about the social psychology of criminalization. How does that process work in our mind? How does it lead to physiological reactions? And then how does it impact our behaviors? I'm going to talk about the illness spillovers and collateral consequences of police violence. How does this play out on the people's bodies when they die and when they live, which is something we don't talk a lot about. We don't talk a lot about survivors of police violence. I'm going to talk about what the police think about Black Lives Matter in particular, and put in context a lot of things. And then I'm going to racialize the criminal justice system, a lot of things that you all have probably heard of, but some important data points. And then I'm going to talk about some strategies and solutions that I've been using to try to address this particular problem. What I've done over the past decade, actually over a decade, is collect a lot of data on this topic. I won't be sharing a lot about the first one, which was a large data set, one of the first using social media data, using 32 million tweets from a year in Ferguson. But I will share some of the ethnographic observations and interview data from trainings that I did with law enforcement and interviews that I did with law enforcement in the community. And then this virtual reality and computer experimental data with over 100 police officers that I think is really, really innovative. And I'll talk about that. Part of what we know at a very simple level is what happens with stereotypes. Stereotypes are simply beliefs about the personal characteristics of members of a particular group, such as Black people. And oftentimes focuses on 4 primary categories: perceptions of intellectual ability, physicality, propensity to commit crime, and emotional well-being. You can pretty much take everything that is said about a person and put it into one of those 4 categories. I'll give you an example. When Hillary Clinton was running for president, what were people saying? Oh, well, I'm not sure if she's too emotional. She cries all the time. Like, it was really playing to the stereotype of women being emotionally unstable, even though we know that's not true. And all you gotta do is watch American football and you see men just doing all kind of emotional stuff. But we don't talk about it like that. Some kind of way we justify a grown man like throwing papers down and yelling and crying and going on. We act like that's okay, right? But then we know specifically for Black people and Black men in particular, there are these perceptions of intellectual inferiority that becomes a corollary of physical superiority. Even though, and this is how stereotypes work, if we go back a century before the boxer beat somebody else, right, a Black boxer, Joe Johnson, before he did that, the stereotypes about Black people were all negative. Black people were viewed as inferior across the host of things. And then when that happened, people were like, oh, well, we'll get him that. We'll give Black people that, right? And so we see how this plays out. And then that physicality plays a role in how we think about people's propensity to commit crime. That people's physical bodies become weapons even when they don't hold one. I'll give you a really good example, some social psychological research. Just raise your hand if when you see this, some of y'all are already flinching, just by seeing the pictures. Raise your hand if you're scared of snakes. Yeah, you like, yep, I'm scared of snakes. So, and raise your hand if you're scared of spiders, like this huge spider right here. I always find it interesting that it's like more people scared of spiders than snakes. So raise your hand if I had a snake around my neck and a spider in my hand, if I threw them out in the crowd, that you would take off running. Raise your hand. Yeah, some of y'all like, I'm out of here, right? So y'all are unlike my youngest son, who's gonna probably be a veterinarian. He just loves UPenn because you all have this amazing animal hospital and facility here. But think about the visceral reaction that some of you all had to just seeing the picture, to me uttering the words. That is a physiological response. It oftentimes leads to fight or flight. Well, that same physiological response that some people have to snakes and spiders is the same physiological response that some people have to black men in close proximity, like being in an elevator. What do you think that reaction does? And part of what it gets at is another concept called subjective uncertainty. Think about it like a glass of water or a glass of anything, liquid, where it's filled up to a certain point. So you have this information. You know the place you might be interacting with somebody at, you know what they look like, but then the rest of that glass is not filled up. And oftentimes what people do, they fill this glass up with stereotypes. And they fill them up oftentimes with negative stereotypes about people. I'll give you an example. This is Robbie Tolan. Robbie Tolan was a minor league baseball player in Texas. His father actually played Major League Baseball. That was his dream as well. But on New Year's, several years ago, in a upper middle class, what people might even consider wealthy neighborhood, suburb, him and his cousin were coming home. Police started following them. You all know all these different rules, which is for a lot of parents, particularly black parents, and black presenting people, right, who might be Latino but black presenting. What my mom always told me, boy, if you within striking distance of the house, you try to come home, right? Just try to get here. That's what Tyree Nichols was trying to do in Memphis, right? He was a stone's throw away from his mama's house when he was screaming out for his mom. He was trying to get home. And I want y'all to think about the number of times we've heard, particularly black boys and men, when they are dying, crying out for their mom, right? So Robbie gets to the house. Police come out, guns are blazing, put him and his cousin face down. His parents come out the house because it's his house. They were like, what are you doing? This is his house. What are you doing? The police then come at Robbie's parents and go to rough up his mom. Robbie is laying face down as a good son would. He raises up to be like, you're grabbing on my mama, and they shoot him. Could never play baseball again. Killed his dream. Didn't kill him, but killed his dream. Let me give you another example of how this plays out with blackness. This is Joseph Sushake. Joseph actually lives in my hometown of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And this incident and another one that I'll mention in a bit literally blew my mind. Now, I don't know if you all can read this, but the key points, I'm gonna actually read some of it because it is literally so mind-blowing. A Murfreesboro man is claiming that he was unnecessarily roughed up by the police. Joseph was in his yard on Minerva Drive. Now, in his yard, what was Joseph doing in his yard? He was doing old man stuff. He had on overalls underneath his car, changing his oil, just doing normal stuff. And the police show up. Now, Minerva and Eagle Street, these are important streets for me because I spent a lot of time on these streets, and my mother-in-law and my father-in-law actually live around the corner from where this happened at, which is why it caught my attention when I saw the streets. Officers alleged that Joseph was a suspect who was running from the police in a stolen Acura. I want y'all to bear in mind what I just told y'all. Just remember what I told you. What did I tell y'all Joseph was doing? He was under his car, changing the oil in overalls, okay? Now, you might be thinking, an Acura. Was Joseph changing the oil on an Acura? No, he wasn't. It was like an old Cutlass or something, okay? So we got that. So he gets roughed up, beat up very badly. Minutes later, after they beat him up, officers realized they had the wrong person in custody and that the person they were looking for was from Laos, was Laotian. They were looking for a Laotian man. Because in Murfreesboro, there's actually a large population of people who are from Laos. Joseph is from Nigeria and is 30 years older than the person that the police were looking for. After officers realized that Shushek did nothing wrong, he was transported to the local hospital where he was treated for his injuries. How do you make sense of that? Because people really try to make sense of it. There's no way to make sense of it other than police are chasing a young Laotian man who just stole an Acura. And they see a black man in front of his house and they're like, he must be doing something wrong. He has to be the person that we're looking for. Because in their heads, that's part of what happens. And what they engaged in is what we call cognitive dissonance. This is when individuals' minds work to affirm existing beliefs. And as a result, we attribute stereotypes onto group members even when they do not align with our existing views and the information that we have. They were just filling it up. And it also speaks to ultimate attribution error, which asserts that undesirable characteristics exhibited by out-group members, say whatever your group part is, in this case we're talking about black people compared to non-black people, then oftentimes those characteristics are more likely to be perceived as part of one's personality and be part of their innate ability, just who they are innately and genetically. And then if they counter those stereotypes, if they become tokens, like we know that Asian Americans oftentimes are all the time, right? And we just for some reason act like that they're just model minorities instead of realizing that there is actually a lot of heterogeneity among Asian and Asian Americans, but we overly simplify it. And among black people, when there are positive stereotypes, we attribute it to education and policing. So we attribute it to the surveillance that the system actually puts onto black people. One really good example of this is Skip Gates, Professor Henry Louis Gates at Harvard, who, of course, if you all have watched Finding Your Roots, you know he takes people and shows people a whole bunch of stuff. He was coming back from a lecture, kind of like this. I actually think he was coming back from overseas. Didn't have his key. He was like, I don't know what my key is. He's probably like me. Like right now, I'm like, where are my keys? I don't know. I'm just giving this lecture. I'll figure it out when I get home. And he was like, but you know, the back window on my house is typically just open, right? He's like, I live in the same neighborhood. Let me check it. He goes around back. It was open. He goes on in, climbs through there, opens up his house. He's now in there pulling his stuff in. Now, some of his neighbors were watching this. And this is in Cambridge, okay? Like, you know, you got Boston and then you got Cambridge, right? Where Harvard is. Now, on his street, y'all, this is Skip Gates. He was pretty much one of the only black people on his street. These white people should know who he is. You know what I'm saying? It ain't too many of him. But they call the police. Police show up. This could have been solved very simply. Show us your ID. Just tell us that you live here. He ends up getting arrested. And what was the response? They have a beer summit at the White House, Dr. Stevenson, where we were talking to VP Harris at. A beer summit with the cop that was primarily involved in. But see, this is what's key. See, that cop was there primarily because he was a supervisor, but I want y'all to look at the picture in the top right. He was not the only cop there. See, oftentimes these decisions are not singular decisions that law enforcement makes, and we act like they are. And I'll get to how I think about structural implicit bias in a second. But part of what this led to is self-justification, that particularly with law enforcement, they can't be viewed as being wrong. They're oftentimes trained for that. So they aim to justify their actions by part of what's going on. This is a really good example here. Just look at the juxtaposition here. So you're probably wondering what's happening on the right. Well, just let me tell you quickly what's happening on the left. The dude on the left was getting ready to shoot somebody. The police officer does not seem remotely worried for his safety or other people's safety. He's like, calm down. Like you would talk to your brother or one of your friends, like, hey, you getting out of pocket. Just calm. I know you got the gun. Just calm down. What about the dude on the right? They got his hands up, laying on the ground. Well, he was shot by a police officer who was out of view on the right. What about the man that's sitting Indian style? That man sitting Indian style is part of a group home. He has mental health issues. The man with his hands up is his caretaker, is his counselor at the facility. The man sitting Indian style had wandered off. He was coming back to get him. Let me tell you why the police were called. The police were called because someone saw the man sitting down with his legs folded, with something that looked shiny, who had been sitting there for a while, and they called the police and said, I'm worried about him. He's here by himself. And then the person said, oh, but someone else is now coming, because sometimes they tell you stay on the phone. Somebody else is coming who seems like they know him. Police show up, run up on the scene quickly, shoot the man standing up with his hands up. The black man laying there said, why did you shoot me? The cop said, I don't know. I know why, because blackness becomes weaponized even when we don't have a weapon. It is viewed as threatening even when it should not be. And part of the way that we think about this is not just the killings that happen, but part of highlighting a lot of these examples is to highlight that there are so many more survivors of police violence and surveillance than there are people who are actually killed, even though that's a high number too that I'll share with you in a second. And it really speaks to what my colleagues and I call the illness spillovers of police violence and the collateral consequences. I published some articles, particularly with Ali Sewell, who is at Emory, and some of my other colleagues, Keon Gilbert, who's at Brookings, and Hetty Lee, who is at Duke. And part of what we did was we looked at what happens if you simply live in a neighborhood that's over-policed. Not even when anything's happened to you, just you live there. What happens? Well, men's mental health suffers. They're more likely to suffer from higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety. And then we already know that they're just less likely to then engage in healthcare utilization with that. So then they're just living with that. Women's physical health suffers. More likely to have higher blood pressure, more likely to be diagnosed with diabetes, more likely to gain weight, simply by living in a neighborhood. Why would that be? Well, on one hand, it could actually happen to you. On another hand, you could witness it. But oftentimes it is through third-person accounts of when you come in the house from work, from school, from playing, there's been a surveillance incident that instantly increases your allostatic load, your blood pressure, that leads to you overeating, that completely derails what should be a happy family moment. That every time, oftentimes black people, particularly young black men, leave the house, the blood pressure of their loved ones rises. On my way here, my wife was like, be careful. She went through this whole rundown of things to be careful about. My whole family is on a thread like, where's Ray? Where's Ed now? Why are they doing that? They're not just doing that because they love me. Like, I know they love me. They're worried. That, why would they be worried? Well, not only am I a black man in society, but what I realized that when I turned 40 a few years ago, because you have like these moments, like, these ages where you turn an age, I was like, is this what a midlife crisis feels like? I don't know. Like this is weird. Maybe so. And so, you had these moments where you're like, what have you done with your life? What are you going to do with your life? And the unfortunate reality of one of the things that popped in my head was that I realized that I had been stopped by the police more times than my age. And I shouldn't have to say this, but I have a PhD and I don't have a criminal record. That is the reality of what it's like in this society. I mean, I can give y'all the rundown of all the ways I've been pulled over, shot by the police. My windows were too dark. My music was too loud. I was coming out too early at a dance competition, like a dance competition I was in. Or I got pulled over because I rolled through a stoplight. Or I got pulled over because I was waiting too long at a stop sign. I got pulled over for rolling through a stop sign, right? I mean, these are the types of things that happen. And then I think about the knowledge that I happen to have, where my great uncle was the first black chief of police in my hometown. I got a certain level of knowledge. Like, when people talk about the talk, like, I think we got to conceptualize that a little bit more. We act like that is one talk. It's not one talk. These are continuous talks over time. And because I had law enforcement and military in my family, my conversations were a little bit different. They oftentimes protected me in ways that they could not protect other people. And even when COVID happened at the beginning, people were a little worried about wearing the masks. They were like, I walked into the store, what's going to happen? But they know what happened with the mask? It became normalized because everybody started to wear it, right? But before that, and black people were the ones that were really adherent to wearing masks, right? And we can talk about the vaccine, slightly different outcome.
people gonna wear their masks, right? And one thing that my work has led to is when Ahmaud Arbery was murdered down in Georgia, I knew exactly what that was. Part of what I found in some of my research, I really want you to focus on the top right, just look at black men.
We could get into the intersectionality and the juxtaposition between black women and black men if you look at the differences in their rates of physical activity, which is what these bars are, in predominantly black, predominantly white, and racially integrated communities. But we're just gonna focus here for the sake of this talk. But I've done a lot of work intersectionality from that perspective, kind of channeling, my Dr. Margaret Bill Spencer here in terms of thinking about race and ethnicity and gender. But I want you to look at this bar over here on the far right. This is predominantly white neighborhoods. Black men exercise the least in predominantly white neighborhoods. And these are middle-class black men, college educated with professional jobs. Why would that be? Because they're surveilled. They're not just surveilled by police, they're surveilled by their neighbors. And then they go through a signaling process. This signaling process is where Irving Goffman talked about, where he talked about you try to signal that you belong. You try to signal that you're a part of a group that people don't think that you're part of. So what do? They wear an alumni t-shirt. When they run it, they wear their Penn sweatshirt, right? When they out walking around, I'm at Penn, right? I'm one of the good ones, calm down, right? Like that's what you're trying to signal. They do things like always have your ID on you. There's a physician in Nashville, one of my closest friends, Dr. Lavelle Allen, who is the first black chief of emergency radiology at Vanderbilt. And he talks about how whenever he goes out, if he's just going out chilling with his family and he just running to the store, he always wears his scrubs. He says it just calms people down. And so notice that, right? When you see black physicians, they wear their scrubs. People like, they comfortable. Yeah, they're comfortable, but they signaling something else. You know how we know that? Because a whole bunch of white physicians don't be walking around with their scrubs like that, right? Them black physicians are signaling something. They wear their ID. They wave and smile at neighbors. Things that you don't really want to do when you're trying to exercise. Like exercise is hard. You don't be smiling at people, right? But this is what black men do, what they report. Think about how stressful that is in a moment where you should be engaging in exercise. And collectively, what this leads to is structural implicit bias. It's part of what comes together. See, we know that implicit bias is our mind's way of just making sense of simple preferences. Two things we put together. You see a chair, your mind tells you you're supposed to sit in it. Our minds are like powerful supercomputers. And so as we're filling up that glass of water, part of what happens is that implicit bias becomes deeply embedded in organizational culture, particularly within law enforcement and surveillance spaces, and oftentimes leads to structurally imposed racial disparities. The structural embeddedness of implicit bias leads to the justification of the use of force against black bodies, of use force and then ask questions later. And that's part of what happens. And we know that this does not just apply to policing. We can look at healthcare, where we know that I think one of the most deleterious and sad outcomes is the maternal and infant mortality rate for black women. It is absurd what happens. Everyone from Serena Williams to Beyonce. If anybody shouldn't have had complications during their birth, it's those fit, amazing women. It's not about how fit they were. And everybody know them. You can't sit up here and say you don't know Serena Williams and Beyonce. But it's the fact that there is something about believing a black woman about her pain level that leads to just, well, is she really in that much pain? Right? It's bringing up the physicality that even happens to black girls and black women, right? Where there's this physicality, this animalistic stereotype that suggests that our pain tolerance is higher. And it leads to all these outcomes. It's one of the reasons why when you look at what happened to Michael Brown, and again, doing what I do, I watch trials, I watch arraignments, I give oftentimes expert testimony, which is oftentimes in written format. Like, I know, like, if y'all like me, Matlock is my favorite show. That gray suit, boy, I was like, it's about time for me to just get the same suit and be like Matlock. I love watching Matlock. And the thing about that typically doesn't happen. Typically, when you're an expert witness, you typically do a written testimony that is then used in court. And one thing that I know about what happened with Michael Brown when I was watching that trial, one of the main reasons why Darren Wilson, he wasn't even indicted for Michael Brown's murder. That's what set people off in November, right, 2014, is that he wasn't even charged Just the grand jury was like, yeah, that's not enough evidence. What did Darren Wilson say? He said he looked like a demon. That's what he said about Michael Brown, about this 18-year-old. He looked like a demon. Now, Halloween is coming up, y'all. I like Halloween. I like it. It's one of my family's favorite holidays. Like, we full out. We dress up, we wear, like, make a whole video. Like, it's a whole family thing. One thing I know about demons, you can't just, like, do normal stuff to take out a demon. You gotta do over extra stuff, like silver bullet type stuff, right? And that's what oftentimes happens with black people and black men in particular. Where, like with Jonathan Farrell in North Carolina, the police officer emptied his clip, reloaded, and emptied it again. Wow. With Michael Brown, Darren Wilson then said, he looked like Hulk Hogan and I felt like I was 5 years old. You know what's fascinating about that? Because Michael Brown was a big man. He was 18, right? He's like 6'4", weighed a lot. Darren Wilson was also 6'4". He was also well over 200 pounds. Like, maybe I could get down with it if he was like 5'6", 5'4", and maybe 140, maybe, right? But this is how it plays out. But this is what's important. That was a script that Darren Wilson was using. Law enforcement are given a script that after they use force, their whole objective is to justify it. Their whole objective is to engage in self-justification. To justify that why I used force is because I felt like this person was dangerous. Right? So, what are some of the things that I've tried to do to address these particular issues? Well, the first is I started to engage in implicit bias trainings with law enforcement. And it's in just like a 1-2 hour thing. Like that don't work. This was a training that when I was the executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland, call it LASER, we got a 2-day intense implicit bias training course approved by the Maryland State Police Training Commission that has now been used in police departments and corporations or organizations across the country. And, you know, we all about data, right? So one of the things we would do is we would give them implicit association tests. We had a survey. They would get implicit association tests. They would also get the symbolic racism scale that gets at explicit racial bias, you know, just what you think about different groups of people. And then we would do a demographic survey. We would do a whole bunch of stuff with them. What we found with a really diverse group of police officers across race, across gender, across education, across age, it literally kind of blew my mind. Like, I remember telling the RA, I was like, this got to be wrong. Go back, look at the data. Like, you giving me something that's not right. And I actually went, you know, when you get up there, other people analyze data, you working with them, you make sure it's right. I was like, I just got to go analyze this myself. This is what we found with the implicit association test that looks at the association between race and weapons. This is a test that says, do you associate different racial groups with weapons? Like a gun, a knife. This is not a mistake. Police officers are significantly more likely to associate black people with weapons, and they practically don't do it at all with white people. Like, see, I want y'all to think about this. It's not just, this is what's so complex and deleterious about racism. It doesn't just knock black people. It doesn't just disadvantages black people. It also advantages white people. See, the gap increases. See, we don't really talk about it like that because the social sciences and research is so deficit prone. We only talk about it in the form of deficits. We rarely talk about it in the form of assets. What you're looking at here, this is a white preference. This is a preference that what I've seen in all the research I've done is this a couple of second pause that saves somebody's life. It's a couple of pause that pops into police officers' heads that could be my brother, that could be my neighbor, that could be the guy that I go to the gym with, that could be the person I go to church with. And they see a black person and they think, that's that dude that did that crazy, horrible thing to this person a month ago. And it leads to them being quick to react on one hand, like when that man was just trying to take care of the young man who had left the group home. And on the other hand, like the picture I showed you where the white man had his hand on the gun, it leads to nothing happening. That's how it plays out. But then it's not just police, as I said. It's all the surveillance that happens. ID Adam, where you asking these people, can they swim in a pool? Pool Patrol Paula doing similar stuff, right? America Max, who, you know, it's interesting how some white people police water. You know? Like it's something very, very basic. And I really didn't get it until I traveled to East Africa, where I realized that in America, we take water for granted. It's accessible all the time, but you go to other parts of the world and water is inaccessible. And if you cut people's water supply off, like when you put cement in their water line, some of y'all got that reference, is that it leads to people reacting a particular way. Permit Patty. This little girl was selling lemonades and cookies. I want y'all to think about this. A little girl selling lemonade and cookies. That's one of the cutest things you're gonna ever see, is a little girl selling lemonade and cookies. Your response is not to buy a cup of lemonade. Your response is to call the police on her. Why would you do that? Because you feel like you control the street. And you don't want these people there. Barbecue Becky. That was in Oakland where I live. Y'all know black people like to cook out. They just chilling at the park cooking out. They ain't bothering nobody. They got some hamburgers, hot dogs, some ribs maybe, like a lamb chop, something. They just hanging out. Music wasn't even that loud. She called the police on them, said that they did not have a permit to be at a public park. Black people playing basketball at a public park. They say they don't have the right to be there. Wake Up Susie, that was one of the craziest ones. Y'all can relate to this at UPenn. This was a student in her dorm at Princeton. Or Cornell, I think it was Princeton. Is that where it was? Yeah. She was taking a nap in between studying for exams. Normal student stuff. This woman called the police on her and said she didn't have the right to be sleeping in the lounge. Just think about the audacity. And think about what I said they did. They called the police. Why'd they do that? Because they knew that the police were going to be more likely to believe them than the black person. Just like that woman who called the police on that man who was setting up, taking pictures of birds in the park. That brother was taking pictures of birds. I mean, it doesn't get less threatening than that. Because it's not about that. It's about the narrative that people have been socialized, that if you perceive and then you enact that black people and blackness is threatening, that people will believe that reality even when it is untrue. And it has a host of implications. For example, let's talk about what police officers think about Black Lives Matter. I got a few other data points, then I look forward to your questions. I want y'all to pay attention to the gold bar here and the green bar here. These are police officers who have over 7 years of experience, who have negative views of Black Lives Matter. The green bar are black cops. The gold bar are white cops. I have so many data points. I remember when Tyree Nichols was murdered, and people calling, journalists would hit me up, and I was like, I'm gonna go on Laura Coates because that's my girl, and she gonna ask amazing questions. I was like, I'm just gonna go on CNN and talk to her, and then I'm gonna be done with it. Because people had this perception in some kind of way that black cops don't enact the same violence against black bodies that white cops do. That's another stereotype. It's like only white cops are doing this. No, they're not. All you gotta do is go to another neighborhood in Philly and you see black cops doing stuff to black people. You go to Latino neighborhoods, you see Latino cops doing stuff to Latino people, right? And so part of thinking about that is I have all these data points on how black cops look the same. I'm gonna show you all in a second on why they are. But what I wanna do is I wanna highlight one primary quote about this. Well, first, let me make this point. I didn't find that race or gender mattered, but I found that age mattered a little bit, that younger cops had a better nuanced understanding of Black Lives Matter. Now, this is what's important. It doesn't really matter what they think, it matters what they do. And they are trained in a particular way to enact the same level of surveillance on black bodies as the older cops are who taught them. Not only because they're trained that way, but because there are real consequences if they don't. Right? Real consequences if they don't. Look at George Floyd and Derek Chauvin. Repeatedly, if you watch that entire video, the younger cops who had just started, less experienced cops, I should say, repeatedly said, should we roll him over? All they had to do was roll him over, but they didn't. That's the reason why they got charged and convicted. Why did they not do that? Because there are real consequences internally for law enforcement if they actually go against the blue wall of silence. See, the blue wall of silence doesn't simply exist because people want to be loyal. It exists because of these consequences, where I've seen so many officers who I work with, who I actually consult with on their cases, internally with HR and externally, where they get pushed down and pushed out. They get pushed down, they get demoted. They get put in the district that's farthest from their house and get put on nights. I want you to imagine, you a sergeant. This is a real sergeant that I know, black cop. Happens to be president of Noble, which is the national black law enforcement organization. He got kids. He was a sergeant, was about to get promoted to lieutenant. He works a desk job. You know, that's what you do when you're good. See, this is the other thing. When you're good as a cop, oftentimes they put you behind a desk. The same thing they do as professors, right? Like when you're good at research, they want you to be an administrator. And it's like, I was good at this thing. I don't really know if I'm gonna be good at this thing. So when you're good at stuff, you get promoted. So you get put behind a desk. So what does that mean? That means oftentimes the most prepared and the best cops who are most community oriented are no longer on the streets. And if you meet a cop who's been working, say, for over 7 to 10 years, they've been working in the same place, there's either one or two outcomes typically that has to do with that cop. One, you should run to that cop. The other outcome, you should run away. On one hand, it means that person is from there or they live there. They just deeply care about that community. Like that is their community. You want them there. People know them. They're valued. They value people. On the other hand, it means they're not good at their job because they haven't been able to get promoted. So the same way that oftentimes they put lower performing, lower quality teachers in low income black schools, they do the same thing with cops. The most problematic cops are in those neighborhoods. So I think you all get the point with that. I want to highlight this top quote. This is what a lot of officers think about Black Lives Matter, particularly more experienced officers. I think Black Lives Matter, in my opinion, is a domestic terrorist organization, just like the KKK. You know, and I bet they're hell bent on seeing the U.S. burn. I want y'all to think about that. Because if you think about it, I don't know, maybe somebody does right now. I don't see no Black Lives Matter shirts. You remember, it was fashionable like 5 years ago. Like we act like we still ain't in that movement. Nobody walking around with the shirts, with the hoodies, with the wristbands. We got to kind of think about that. But think about, this is what cops thought about you when you did that. Part of what this collectively does is systemic and institutional discrimination may be maintained through a series of uncoordinated individual acts of discrimination that collectively maintain the status quo and inequalities among racial groups. Those uncoordinated individual acts, all those incidents, it's not like people got together at a campfire and kumbaya and was like, yeah, hey, this is what we're gonna do. When that little girl come out with that lemonade now, we're gonna call the police. No, it's just something about seeing black people experience life in a normative way that needs to be disrupted. Like we just doing normal stuff leads to us having the police called on us. So let me go through a few quick stats. Let's look at some different places. This is nationally. I want you all to look at this. This is the likelihood of different police encounters, an arrest, a street stop, use of force, and lethal use of force. Again, you know how I was saying earlier that it's not just a black disadvantage, it's a white preference? This shows that. Look at the red bars. The red bars are almost just as long, and in some places in the use of force category, longer than the black bars above. So not only is it that black people are significantly more likely to be arrested, stopped, have force used on them, and lethal force, white people are significantly less likely on average for what they do to be arrested, have force used against them, be stopped, and have lethal force used on them. The gap goes like this. It's a black disadvantage and a white preference. We can look at a whole bunch of cities. We can look at Oakland. Black people are stopped and questioned. We can go to Minnesota. Look at that stat. You can barely even graph that. The likelihood of it happening to black people. And then you see the negative likelihood for white people. We can go to Ohio. Same thing. Vehicle stops. What does that look like? Black people are just so much more likely to have it happen to them. And this is what's interesting. Up until the past few years, really since COVID, I think it's really a COVID effect mixed with an economic downturn as to why we're seeing an increase in violent crime. And I hope that it starts to pivot back down. We've had a couple of periods of pivoting back down. But the point is since 1990, when violent crime was similar to what it was in the 70s, it was at its peak. Violent crime has significantly decreased since then. Now, you wouldn't know that when you watch the news. I watch the news, I'll be like, oh my God, I shouldn't even let my kids go outside. Like, it's just, like, you shouldn't even go to the car. Like, you just shouldn't do anything. You shouldn't even go to Trader Joe's. You know, Trader Joe's like a safe place for a lot of people. You shouldn't even go there. But like violent crime isn't explaining what we're seeing. Let me give you a really good graph for mapping police violence. This is a graph showing the police killing rate, which is the red squares, and the violent crime rate, which is the blue X's. Now, if people who engaged in violent crime were being killed by the police, people might not like that, but people might at least, the trend might make sense for people. That's not what's happening. These two metrics are completely unrelated. They're not even correlated to one another. The cities that have the highest police killings are not the same cities that have violent crime and vice versa. You can look at all the cities. I mean, we can find Philly on here. Philly is on this list somewhere. And I mean, here goes Philly right here on the right. I want y'all to look at this. Here goes Philly's violent crime rate. This was in 2015. This is the violent crime rate. This is the police killing rate. So Philly is actually on the right side of this curve, if we want to think about it like that, compared to most of the cities where we see the police killing rate being much higher. What about social class? That's an argument people make. People say, oh, well, it's a certain type of black person. Like we like, the tokens. We like the good ones. No, that's not the case either. Let me show you what you're looking at. These two solid lines are black people. These two dotted lines are white people. This is the likelihood of being killed by police. This is from Nancy Krieger at Harvard. So what you're looking at, the red lines are affluent people, college educated people. The teal lines are low income folks. And when you look at this, you're probably looking at this spike saying, what the heck is that? Those were our civil rights leaders being killed in the 60s. Who, mind you, the same police that were police before the 64 Act, before the 65 Act, before the 68 Fair Housing Act were the same police after that. Last point, what about stop and frisk in New York? See, part of what you're getting at is the point I'm making. Oftentimes these people are engaging in these acts and not doing anything wrong. This was from 700,000 police stops. This particular study led to stop and frisk being ruled unconstitutional, even though Adams has brought it back and it's de facto in a lot of places. But it was nearly 700,000 police stops. You can see the percentages of stops by race. 56% of these stops involve frisking. Look at the number of times force was used for black people, Latinos, for white people. Here goes the key point. Only 2% of these stops led to the discovery of contraband, an illegal weapon, or an outstanding warrant, 2%. 88% of these stops led to nothing, even though over 50% were frisk, and then force was used in a lot of them, and 6% only resulted in an arrest. Yeah, you think? For like holding people down when they shouldn't be arrested. Most of those people were arrested for resisting arrest. And if we look in this primary period, and this trend has continued through 2023, that every year in the United States, police kill over 1,000 people. A person is killed by the police every 8 hours. Every 40 hours, a black person is killed by the police. And black people are significantly more likely to be represented here. Let me walk y'all through everything that I'm saying, then I'm about to close. This is roughly the percentages of the population, right? We'll focus primarily here on black people. This is the percentage of people killed by police. Only one of these bars gets bigger. That's black people. Again, for people who say, oh, well, those black people doing something wrong. That's why they were killed by the police. Look at this bar down here. This bar is for people killed by the police who were not attacking and did not have a weapon at the time they were killed. I want y'all to really look at the 31 and 39%. Let me really break it down. The gap, once we take into account whether or not the person was attacking and had a weapon. Who says this? Police. These are conservative estimates coming from the FBI. Like the 40% of police agencies that submit data to the FBI. So they were presenting some of their best data, right? Because it's voluntary to actually submit policing data to the federal government. Like that's just asinine. It's wild to think about that. And I actually worked with the FBI to try to increase that percentage. And we failed on that, but we keep trying. This gap actually increases. In other words, black people are even more likely to be killed by the police when they are not attacking and don't have a weapon. What is doing that? Blackness is doing that. And we know that there are a series of people who this has happened to, where these huge civil settlements are paid out. If you haven't heard about Corinne Gaines in Baltimore, I don't have time to get into it, but I hope you look up her story, because it's a story that does not get enough discussion. And we go on and on. These huge settlements. You all know who pays these settlements? Y'all do. This money comes out of taxpayer money. In the case of Breonna Taylor, her own money as an EMT was used to pay her family back for her being killed in her own apartment. And the drywall in between her apartment and her neighbors got more justice than she did. Where her neighbors, like the officers who got that small conviction, they were convicted because they shot through the wall at her neighbors, not shot her. And this starts real early. This is preschool suspensions. Just look at this orange bar. The gray are the percentage, so white, Black, Latino, Asian, American Indian, Alaskan Native, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, and multiracial folks. We have gray is the percentage of the preschool population. The orangish red is the percent of preschoolers who are suspended. Only one of these orange ones don't look like the other. That's Black. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I don't really know what preschoolers are doing to get suspended. Like, they do normal baby preschool stuff. They jump, they play, they yell, they throw stuff, they scream, they eat. Normal stuff, right? And so why would this be happening? Well, for some people, they like, them little Black kids, they just bad. They need to be surveilled in police. No, that's not what it is. There was actually a study that looked at, I love these studies. They literally put goggles on teachers, like glasses that had tracking on them. And I used these in the lab that I was running, like eye tracking down to the millisecond. And then they had individuals who were observing the classroom interactions. And so they were looking at this, and what they saw was that the kids were engaging in similar activities. But when the teachers turned around, who do you think they looked at? They looked at Black boys, or they looked at boys and they looked at Black boys, right? And that's who they were really policing and surveilled. And how does this play out in jobs? Well, that was Diva Pager, who left us with a gem before she passed away, professor at Harvard. She did this large study where she sent resumes and then she sent people out to get jobs. It only varied by two main factors: race and whether or not a person had a criminal record. And what she found truly shocked her. Not only did white people without a criminal record get called back and hired more than Black people, but white people with a criminal record got called back and hired more than Black people without. That's race. We see the same thing play out in who's convicted based on the jury pool. That what's interesting about juries, and why if you like me, when you get that summons, you be like, gotta take a whole day off from work. They're gonna have me on a trial for a week or two, but this is why you need to do it. Because the mere presence of one Black person, or I would argue even probably one person who's gonna be willing to speak up and speak out and be an accomplice and be an ally and an advocate, disrupts the discrimination that happens in convictions. Well, simply the mere presence of a Black person being on the jury basically makes the conviction rate non-significant. And when there are no Black people on the jury pool, you see this huge disparity between Black people and white people being convicted of the same crimes. Part of what we tried to do was we created a virtual reality decision-making program for police, where we created with our computer scientists on campus over 90 virtual reality scenarios. We went out with them. We set these scenarios up. We really wanted to get at behavior rather than just people's attitudes, implicitly and explicitly. And then we had the opportunity to partner with Google to help develop their virtual reality program and receive funding from Jigsaw Google to do that. This is in the lab where this became a fully immersive AI, fully 360 experience where the algorithm is responding to officers based on their tone of voice, their pitch, how close they are in the space. And we can literally collect tons of information about officers and get that back. They fill out a police report. What did we find with this? Well, as I told you before, officers really don't vary. You can see this middle line here. No significant differences by gender, by age, by department, by education. We found a marginal significance for white and Black people when we looked at the implicit association score, but overwhelmingly nothing was there. And this is what's even more complex. Implicit and explicit bias have a very low power correlation. It's only 0.3. So that means people who have implicit bias are not the same people who have explicit racial bias, and the people who have explicit bias are not the same people who have implicit racial bias. It's way more complicated than we could think, which is why we have to have policies that deal with people's behaviors. Because part of what we found was across these different scenarios, a domestic disturbance scene, a robbery at a store, a suspicious person at a bus stop, this was a rating that was actually getting at deference, how respectful police were of the person they were interacting with. And if you look at the red bars, for the house scene and the bus stop scene, black men had the least amount of deference and respect. Police officers were the most aggressive with them. We would expect that, right? Why would that be? Because going back to subjective uncertainty, officers had the least information in those scenes. But what happens when we give them tons of information, like in the store scene, where they come in and there's a person behind the counter with a uniform on? Instantly, they perceive that that person is the victim. And victimology is one of the biggest findings that we found. And if you look in the store scene, we asked them from 1 to 10 if they perceived that the person was a criminal, which is in blue, or if they perceived that the person was a victim in red. And all of a sudden, the racial differences go away. Why is that so important? Because when police show up and they don't have all the information to fill up their glass, they perceive that the white person is the victim and the black person is the criminal. And that drives pretty much all of the outcomes that we could talk about. First, everything that I talked about, I didn't really talk about the other collateral consequences of this. I primarily focused on the health aspects. Another collateral consequence is you get people wrapped up in the system and they can't vote, right? They don't want to engage politically. One of the other findings that I have from my work on physical activity is that their surveillance I talked about that black men experience leads to them being less civically engaged in their community. It makes sense. Why do you want to go to a HOA with people that done call the police on you when you're trying to go for a run? You stop engaging civically. With that being said, outside of that group and how we have to make people whole when it comes to them being formally incarcerated and justice involved, I did a series of analyses about who votes and where they vote at. And for some reason, all these numbers aren't popping up here. But nonetheless, I want to show you, let me see, across different states, let me point out a few key metrics. The teal color, the teal blue, is the black percentage among state voters. The purple is the black percentage of the state population. And the green is the percent of black people, the percentage that black people represent among all Democratic voters in those states. Let's just focus on green. Y'all know what I see here? Across a lot of states that Democrats won a lot of things in, whether it be Ohio, South Carolina, even North Carolina, Michigan, Maryland, Georgia, which we know flipped. Without black people, Democrats wouldn't win anything. I say that to say that black people actually vote in the years of Obama, because they felt like they had a really viable candidate, actually voted at a higher percentage than white people did in the presidential election. And in pretty much all presidential elections, voted at a higher rate than Latinos and Asians. But the stereotype we have is that black people don't vote. When actually, black people do. Which is why a lot of people aim to ensure that black people can't vote, which is a different metric, because they know black people actually do, right? And I think for some people, they think that it makes a whole lot of sense to not vote for people who you don't think represent your interest. There, of course, are others of us who are like, vote no matter what. Vote for the lesser of 2 or 3 evils, because people don't work too hard. People had to count the bubbles on a bar of soap. They had to count the plies on toilet paper. But the point is that black people actually do vote. And what I hope is that when we hear, oh, if black people would just go out and vote, actually black people do vote. Like, we have to change that. Now, the question might be whether or not black people should vote at an even higher rate, given voter disenfranchisement. That's a whole nother story. As we look particularly at the South, like we look at Texas, Republicans in particular have doubled down on Texas and Florida, where if you look at Texas in particular, roughly 500 voting places have simply went away. They're non-existent. There are people having to take 2-3 buses to go vote. Because, you know, unlike Philly, where it's kind of condensed, and I like it how quickly you can get around. I ride my bike when I stay in places in Philly. But if you're in Texas, shoot, you might be in a county that's 100 miles long. Good luck trying to get to that one mail-in ballot place. So I say all that to say, I think what we really have to do is think about making people whole and restoring people's voting. And I think that's one of the big things that we have to do. And of course, there are a lot of states that have done that, but not enough to try to help people ensure that once they get out from being incarcerated, that they get workforce opportunities, but also that they can vote in future elections.
You mentioned when you talked about signaling, I wanted to say Black officers do the same thing, but for different reason. Oftentimes, there's very few of us. I'm in law enforcement, have been for 23 years. And oftentimes there's very few of us, and will sometimes be put into a position to fill the need to signal to our white counterparts that we are one of them, that we aren't necessarily doing a fair assessment of a situation because it involves someone who looks like us. We aren't necessarily going above and beyond for someone who looks like us. So I wanted to bring up that point about signaling, how it can work both ways, especially in law enforcement. But my question is about policy. And you talked about policy being the difference maker in holding police accountable. And I wanted to know, in your numbers and in your research, how have you seen the policies around education and increasing the education requirements for police in creating a significant change in professionalism and outcomes on the street? I have to have less hours of in-service training each year to maintain my certification than the woman who colors my hair.
Yeah.
And to your question, yes, so research documents that education matters, not in ways that we think exactly. So what happens with education, if you raise the education requirements, then you have to raise the pay, right? If you raise the pay, then what that means is you might be able to attract a different caliber of person who might be interested in the profession. Because I think that law enforcement and teaching are two of the most undervalued professions that we have, right? Particularly when we talk about teachers. They spend half of the waking day with their kids. Law enforcement, we call them or they come to our aid when the worst things have happened, right? But yet and still in most major cities, they can't afford to live in either one of those professions. So you increase the education, and all of a sudden it raises the standards, raises the pay. The other thing that education does that we found with our ethnographic study, it improves the internal policies in law enforcement. It makes them better. The other thing we found, even though we didn't find an education effect in the VR, what we have seen in our ride-alongs is that it actually, and even in our VR, we were just picking up a different metric. It actually leads to more communication. The more education you have, the more oftentimes words you might convey to try to solve a problem. And we see all those things playing out. And the final point I'll make, there's research showing that Black chiefs are actually in departments that have fewer use of force cases and fewer police killings. Why would that be? Because they advance the policies internally, right? So I completely agree. I mean, education is extremely important. I think that it's something that needs to happen in law enforcement, particularly and see, this is the thing. We ain't talking about in Philly necessarily. We talking about there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the country, many of whom you can just barely be getting out of high school and they putting you on the police force. That's what we're talking about, right? That we overly focus on large cities without realizing all the other agencies where you can have a 20-year-old who, I mean, they can't even drink yet, supposedly, right? But they can actually hold a gun and do this. And then the training that is actually required. I mean, we already know that there are more regulations to drive a vehicle than it is to get a gun. And so when it comes to law enforcement, we see that playing out all the time. Look, in my family, either you become a nurse or you go to the military and be a cop. They were like, oh, Rayshawn was still in school. Like, you know, that was a joke in my family. They like, he's still in school. So this is how I think about it. I'll make this first point. It's actually what just happened. What I do, and sorry if I re-traumatize people by showing certain images. I get how that is. I do think there's something raw about seeing Black pain in a space where in the academic space, to be honest, rarely do rooms look this diverse. Right. A lot of times I'm lecturing to rooms full of white people who have never even been physically close enough to a black person to feel their pain. And it's important for them to go through that experience. So that's one way that I think about it. As far as us doing equity work, it's hard, as you know. It's hard. It's hard to speak truth to power. There are consequences to it that we don't talk enough about. Professionally and personally, there are consequences to it. I mean, the amount of threats that I get. Police have been parked in front of my house, parked in front of my crib with my babies. Like, you know where you taking my mind back to? Like places where I grew up at in terms of how I think about that situation. So I think about it like this. First point is, I talk to people who make me laugh every single day. Like, so I'm gonna give you the rundown. I talk to people who make me laugh every single day. This work is hard. It's not good. Like I tell people, you know, people will see me doing something and they'll be like, oh yeah, I heard you on this or I saw you on that. And I think they look at my reaction and it's like somber. It's not like a thank you. Why am I doing that? Because if you see me somewhere, that means I'm talking about something bad that's happened to a black person. It's hard. I can't smile about that simply because I'm on TV talking about it. I'm on TV talking about it to try to expose the research that's highlighting about it. So I laugh. I talk to the funniest people I know every single day. I got a funny friend from college. I got a funny friend from grad school. I talk to them every day. Now it's kind of easy because my youngest son is pretty much the funniest person I know. So it's easy. Like every day I'll be looking at somebody having a bad day. He say something funny. I'm like, I needed that. And he'll be like, yeah, I know. And then he run off, right? So I appreciate that. The other thing I do, you got to really, really treat your body like a temple. You got to prime yourself. You have to sleep. I sleep, y'all. Like I sleep and I sleep good. Now when I'm up, I'm running. Like 16 hours, I'm running. But when I'm sleeping, I sleep. I don't do that whole 3, 4, 5 hour thing. Don't get me wrong. Just for those of you in your PhD program. And then when you get an assistant, like you're gonna have to do some of that, right? You're gonna have to work 60, 80, 100 hours sometimes. Like, but that's not all the time. Just push through that. So I sleep, I exercise. It is essential that in our line of work, we are very, very sedentary. We could, like real talk, in the academy, we can go days without moving. Like literally, we can literally, you walk to get the remote, you walk to the refrigerator, you can go back to your desk and sit on, like literally, we can go days. You have got to move your body all the time. You also have to experience the sun. And the thing that I'll say about being in grad school and being a young career scholar, you have to leave where you are at least once a month. You got to get out to space. It doesn't matter how much you like the city. It doesn't matter if you're from the city. Like I think KJ was telling me that, like, it doesn't matter if you're from Philly or not. You got to leave this space every month. You just got to go somewhere and see something. See what you like to do. Like for me, it's water. I just went down there in Philly. Y'all can do that. Y'all got the water here. But you go somewhere else. The final thing I'll say, you got to eat healthy. You have got to do it. Like, and the thing about grad school that's interesting, for a lot of people, they're in grad school in their 20s and their 30s. For those of us that's getting up there in age, you know, your body start doing something different, right? Like that food you used to be able to eat, your body's like, I don't know what that was. Don't ever do that again in life, right? So, and I say this to say, these sound like very simple things, but as a person who was in grad school, I went to grad school in Indiana University, y'all. That's a whole different level. I remember when I saw Get Out, I was like, that's my experience. Like I'm not one of those people that be like, oh, that's me, like that. I feel seen, like that. I don't really do that. But when I watched Get Out, I was like, I feel seen. Like that was my grad school experience. Black people would see each other and they would just stare at each other like we were deers, right? I say all that to say it was a hard space. I gained 60 pounds my first year of grad school. Is the point of me bringing it up. Like I'm not just saying running down this list to run it down. I'm saying I know it. I experienced it. And the academy will eat us up and chew us out. Do not let the academy kill us, right? Do not let the academy kill us. Part of what we have to do, we got to realize we are here to represent people who are not here, who have not had the ability to be here. And so we got to make sure we take that seriously. The whole, like, put on your oxygen mask before you give it to other people. Take care of yourself. Like, look, final point, I schedule this stuff. I schedule my workouts. People be like, can I meet at this time? I look on my calendar. Nope. I got a meeting. You don't have to know what my meeting is. My meeting is with me, myself, and I in the gym. Because if you don't do that, you'll look up and you hadn't worked out in 3 weeks because you've been compensating for other people saying yes to stuff that you should actually say no to?
I'm appreciating a lot of the work that's coming out of the academy. I'm not one who believes that knowledge is power. So I'm wondering, based on all of the work and the data points and everything, what other elements from the place of movement and struggle need to be added to the research in order to make movement one of the behaviors that we're focused on? Because I think the academy has held it down. I think we know enough from your perspective in order to make movement on policy. Who else needs to be in the game?
Yeah, great question. I'll highlight, I'll make 2 points. The first is what I said earlier about assets. We're so focused on deficits and deficit data that we don't focus enough on assets. Oftentimes assets that come from the communities that we're interacting with. Second point I'll make on the policy front. Learning how to do policy is, now I actually had an interesting route because my postdoc was with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in health policy. I learned policy very, very well. But I also know that there was only a cohort of 6 of us. We were either at Berkeley, Michigan, or Harvard. A lot of people did not get that access. They did not get that 2 years of doing that work. So part of the issue is that in grad school, we don't learn how to do policy. We learn how to examine deficits and expose gaps, not how to create solutions. So what we have to start doing is transforming our curriculum. And students are asking for this. Right, it's part of the reason why the current generation, they're pushing back against the canon. They're like, I don't even want to be an academic. I want to go do something else. Sometimes they don't even know what that something else is, but it's part of the reason why my trajectory has went like it did. Was in Maryland, was getting ready to get promoted to full. I went to Brookings to be a senior fellow. Now I'm at the American Institutes for Research running the Equity Initiative to be able to give out grants. I understand that my trajectory is different, but I hope that it is one such model to look at that then leads to me being in the room with Dr. Stevenson at the White House, where you get these types of moments, but it's really about the work that leads up to that I have been trained to think about policy in a particular way. I have trained myself that when I write op-eds, I'm not just writing those op-eds for the sake of writing them. I'm writing them with a specific audience in mind, a very limited audience. I'm not writing for everybody. I mean, I hope everybody reads the stuff, but I'm not writing for everybody. I'm writing oftentimes for policy makers, very specific policy makers, even individuals on a specific committee. So right now I'm serving on a White House committee on artificial intelligence and law enforcement. Given some of what I presented at the end, maybe that makes sense, right? I'm also on a home appraisals task force for the state of Maryland to deal with the gap in home appraisals that we know that exist in Black communities, even when you have the same house use the same materials. So I think we have to start training in this space. And I think what's missing now are teach-ins. You know, it used to be you go back decades, people would have teach-ins. It doesn't happen in the same way anymore. And I think it's 2 reasons. Not only is it because of COVID and students are trying to figure out what that looks like coming out of that, but even before COVID, when we shifted to using laptops instead of desktops, like I remember when I took stats, you had to go to a stats lab in the same room, like with everybody, and you interacted with everybody. Now you don't have to do that. You get your laptop and you leave. The lack of interaction, and this is why I was saying earlier at the beginning to students, take every opportunity to meet people. Don't just view your education as only classes. That's not why you're here. You're here to interact with people who can transform how you think about things. So as much as I talk about it, and IU was great for me. Bloomington was the problem. But the one thing I remember is that it would take an hour to get from the airport in Indianapolis to Bloomington. And I took every advantage to take speakers every chance I got. I was like, I just got a full hour with Lawrence Bobo. Get the heck with Prudence Carter, with these giants, right? And who come back around. So we have to transform this. And I know this is happening under Dr. Stevenson's leadership here. And I think for a lot of us who have the ability to run programs, we have to start transforming that and getting back to these teaching models to really teach students what it looks like to engage in practitioner work. And final point of this, we also have to buck back against the perspective that we're doing research just for pure research sake. No, we didn't get into that for this. And don't let people tell you that applied research is watered down or less than. Now you still got to publish, like you got to publish your work. But once you publish your work, then think of another way to get a line on your CV, do an op-ed, do a podcast, talk to people, share with a community group who needs to hear your research.
Malcolm X in '64 in the Ballot and Bullet speech talked about an idea of folks in the Black community one day creating General Motors, one day creating Woolrich, General Motors was the largest company in 64 by $1.5 billion in revenue. That's a little bit like saying Tesla and Amazon.
That's right.
Right? And I find that sometimes in the DEI community, there isn't always the opportunity to engage with brothers and sisters in the business community.
That's right.
So that there can be a more strategic understanding of coordinated policy, of the importance of access to capital. So this community that has 2% of US household wealth after 400 years can progress forward. So what if you could comment a little bit on that idea and what steps could be taken going forward?
Yeah, great question, and very important when we talk about wealth, right? When it comes to the home ownership gap between blacks and whites is bigger today than it was in 1960. White people have 10 times the amount of wealth that black people do when we look at household wealth. And when we look at that, the question becomes, what's going on? A lot of people are like, oh, well, it's their behaviors. No, it's not. It is literally these policies. So what do we do about it is your point. Well, I'll say yesterday, I was with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, and we had a panel on this, assembling 4 of the black banks. This is the thing. There are only roughly 20 black banks in the United States. Black-owned banks, roughly 20. We need so many more than that. And part of what you're getting at is people pooling together their resources in a way that we know that, particularly when it comes to private equity, that's how it happens. But long before stuff gets on the stock market, people are investing in things. And part of what we have to do, there's research by Sandra Susan Smith at Harvard, who shows that oftentimes black people, because what we get is fragile, that we hold on to it very tightly. We have to get to a point where we start to share some of these secrets and start to share how we've built this, right? How we've built successful relationships and partnerships, how some people have built their wealth, right? Like some of the black millionaires, you don't really know who they are. Sometimes they want it that way. but part of that is we have to identify them, and we have to get them in spaces to share this information, and then start talking about how to invest collectively, how people made their money, what's happened. And honestly, everybody can't be an entrepreneur. Like, everybody's not good at it, nor does everybody want to do it. But I'm a big fan of, you got to have some kind of side hustle, and you got to start thinking about how you set up what you're doing with your assets. And I think part of the last point I'll make on this, I touched on home ownership. Let's talk about student loans. Look, most people, roughly 50% of wealth is built through home ownership originally, the equity in home ownership. If black people don't have it because we're in neighborhoods that are devalued, my colleague at Brookings, Andre Perry, found on average that black homes in predominantly black neighborhoods compared to predominantly white are worth $50,000 less. That's your kid going to college right there, right? So we have to deal with that. When it comes to thinking about education, then that means we're taking on a lot of student loan debt. Final point of advice that I tell students getting ready to go to school, and you all talking to other people or talking to you all, go to where they're giving you the money. Like literally try to avoid taking out student loans and doing that. Get your scholarships, get your grants, go to where they're paying for that. But we have to start building capacity together in a way that we did decades ago. All right, thank you.
Very much, Dr. Ray.